So, this is Jonathan Klassen. Abby and I are getting close to wrapping up the oral history project we've been working on, called Rebels, Exiles, and Bridge Builders, Cross-Cultural Encounters in the Campos of Chihuahua. We began in the middle of January, so it's been about 4 months now that we've been busy with contact work, interviews, transcriptions, translations, and creating videos for the DARP Stories YouTube channel. We ended up conducting about 40 interviews, and of those, about half have been in Spanish. And it has been just a great experience and pleasure to meet so many interesting people that we wouldn't have met outside of the context of this project. And we feel like we made many new friends in the Campos Menonitas in Mexico, and we're grateful for that opportunity. Veronica Ents, who is a visual artist and was our key kind of contact person there in the Campos, suggested that Abby and I also record an interview as part of this project, which is a good idea. And it's only fair that after so many others have been willing to share their thoughts and experiences and stories with us, that we would be willing to do the same. So today Abby and I would like to have a bit of a conversation, and hopefully it will give some context and clarity to who we are, what this project is, how it was shaped and formed, and why we are interested in the topic. And also, before we begin, just as a note, Abby is the one heading up this project. She has been the one conducting the interviews with our participants. While we were down in the Campos, I would tell people that ella es la jefa, soy solamente el ayudante, so that she's the boss and I'm just the assistant. But today I'll kind of flip that script a little bit, so to say, and I'll be interviewing her, although of course it'll be more conversational. And so thank you, Abby, for all your hard work on this project and for being such a good project director and for having this conversation today.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. This has been really quite an amazing journey and adventure. And I just want to take an opportunity to thank you for all the hard work that you've done on this project. Transcribing, driving, navigating, so many different aspects of this project for it all to come together. And so I'm just really excited to see how this project turns out, what the responses are, and just really extremely grateful for the opportunity to have had this experience down in the Campos Menonitas and to do that together. So thank you.
Yeah, that has been a great experience, and it's just been enjoyable and a learning opportunity. So let's begin with a few questions, I guess. First of all, with the title of the project, Rebels, Exiles, and Bridge Builders, Cross-Cultural Encounters in the Campos Menonitas of Chihuahua. To me, it kind of seems like there are, three aspects of this title, focusing on certain people, doing or experiencing certain things in a specific place. So maybe we can address those three things. Who are these people? What types of encounters are you interested in? And why is this location, the Campos Menonitas in Chihuahua, a good place for this project?
Yeah, so it's interesting. This project specifically is called Cross-Cultural Encounters in the Campos Menonitas of Chihuahua. But I feel like the project really started and came to light several years ago in Seminole. Growing up, hearing from people from a Mennonite background, talking about their experiences growing up in Mexico. And so this project really grows out of those stories over the years. And so I in listening to those stories, I really began seeing a pattern of the different types of people, different types of conflicts, different types of challenges and rewards that people were experiencing there in the Campos Menonitas of Chihuahua. And in thinking about how to organize this project and the types of encounters that people were having, those three words, rebels, exiles, and bridge builders, just really seem to fit the types of interactions that people were having in those stories. And so in terms of those three different types of people, and it's interesting because several people talked about how a lot of times they end up embodying, multiple aspects of two or more of those types of labels. But really that those terms, rebels, exiles, and bridge builders, really gets at the heart of what those interactions are like, both between different people in the Mennonite community there in Chihuahua, but then also those encounters that people from the Mennonite community are having with mestizo people and the indigenous people in the surrounding community, and vice versa, the experiences that mestizo and indigenous people are having with the Mennonite community. And so that's why rebels, exiles, and bridge builders.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then to add even a bit more complexity is the fact that even among the Mennonites themselves, you have pretty well demarcated, denominational lines, and so the Mennonites talk about the three main branches of the Mennonite Church, and there's some non-denominational Mennonites, and of course there's some Mennonites that attend, Spanish-speaking non-Mennonite churches, and so on. And so really, we're looking at interactions between the three main cultures in the region, like you said, the Mennonites, Tarahumaras, Mestizos. But then there are also these encounters between denominations within the Mennonite community or within the Mestizo community as well, between, for example, Protestants and Catholics. And that, I know, came up in different interviews as well. And then also in the Tarahumaras as well, between kind of Protestant Christian Tarahumaras, and then talking about their family members and so on who were not, who still hold to more traditional belief systems, living in the mountains and so on. So that is just another aspect of complexity and encounter across these other lines as well. And it is also interesting that this area of Chihuahua, of the state of Chihuahua in Mexico, they call the region of the Tres Culturas, specifically for this reason, because there's the three main people groups that inhabit the area.
And I think it's really interesting because, excuse me, the region surrounding the Campos Menonitas really is a crossroads, a place of convergence, not only of the three primary cultures there in the community, but also of the United States and Mexico. There's so much influence that's coming in from the United States, also from Canada with the Mennonite migration back and forth to Canada, but then also with internal migration, meeting a lot of people who work with people from other parts of Mexico, migrating for better work opportunities within Mexico itself, from Central America. And so another reason why I wanted to explore this region is just because of all of the cultural convergences, linguistic convergences, and convergences across time. How the interactions between cultures have changed since almost 100 years that the Mennonites have been in the region.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it's a very kind of complex and therefore interesting kind of field of research, and it was enjoyable to experience some of that and hear some of those stories. And so let's talk a bit about the methodology used in finding participants, how participants were discovered and contacted. What were some of our key contacts that kind of were the foundation to build off of?
Yeah, and so I would say there's kind of a couple different branches of finding contacts. The first set of contacts, I would say, arise out of contacts from Seminole. We interviewed your dad for this project, and about his experiences growing up in the Campos Menonitas in the 60s and the 70s. And so he was a big contact, part of that, people from Seminole. But then also Veronica Entz, as we mentioned earlier, a visual artist there working in the Campos Menonitas. I had worked with her previously on some projects, and she was absolutely pivotal in connecting us to people from all different backgrounds, from more, to say, liberal branches of the Mennonite community, people who are more conservative, people within the mestizo community. She really is a bridge builder in that sense of she knows different people from different walks of life, and has those just really good relationships that when she makes those connections for you, that people trust you, and oh yes, of course, like, a friend of hers is a friend of ours. And so that was really key. And then once those contacts were made through Veronica or through some people in Seminole, Billy Froese at the Steinreich Bible School was also really pivotal with making those connections up there. Is just, I really feel like it's representative of how the community works, of, oh, well, this person knows this person, and we'll introduce you to this person, and just really the interconnectedness and the very communal nature of interactions in the community. And so I was speaking with Dr. Patricia Isla Salinas there at the University of Ciudad Juarez, the Cuauhtémoc location, about the research that she does with the Mennonite communities. And she talked about her research methodology with contacts as talking about the bola de nieve, the snowball technique, and that basically once you're making those initial contacts, that it kind of snowballs, because then, this person introduces you to another person, to another person, to another person, and soon, contacts that you would never have been able to make, just, on first contact, that you're introduced to people and situations, that are very different and sometimes very removed from your own experience, but in a good and beautiful way, that those contacts are made. And so I would say, just echoing off of Dr. Isla Salinas's methodology, for finding contacts within the Mennonite community. And also that extends out to, I believe, the Tarahumara, the indigenous community as well, just the importance of having those established relationships in order to make contacts. Yeah,
definitely within the Mennonite community, there's a bit of a sense of conferred trust, maybe, where, I don't know you, but you know so-and-so, and therefore I to some degree trust you. It was mentioned and asked of us several times, are people willing to be interviewed? And they definitely were. We had as many interviews as we could handle time-wise.
Yeah,
And
we actually had people that ended up, not being able to be interviewed because there was just not time. There was, yeah, plenty
and
of
I
people
think,
willing to be interviewed.
yeah, and so these people said, "Well, that's interesting because often, or at times, students from different universities would try to come and do research, and many times it seemed like, at least in their opinion, it was not successful." And I feel like to some degree within the Mennonite community, it was helpful that I'm of a Mennonite background and just having the Mennonite name, even though, for example, I don't speak Plotich very well at all, and I was not born in Mexico, and I've never lived in the Campos, but just that connection of being a Mennonite and the fact that I had family that was born and lived there in the past and so on, I think opened up a lot of those doors, maybe.
I mean, it was really fascinating to be meeting people and they say, "Oh, well, who is your family? Who is your dad? Who is your, oh, we knew your grandfather." Like we knew. And so like these connections that were forged sometimes 40, 50 years ago, were still really important for people to orient, who you are and, their relationship to you.
Yeah, again, having kind of this sense of automatic trust, maybe based on, oh, you're being a Mennonite, you can't have very devious ends in mind because you're also kind of in one way, in some way, one of us. So, so that was good and interesting. So talk a little bit about the use of technology and social media and so on within the context of this research project and within the even the context of the snowball technique of finding participants.
So a tool that I found very helpful first was Facebook. A lot of the initial contacts that I did were through Facebook, through initial contacts of people that I had heard about through Veronica, or people in Seminole, like, "Oh, hey, you should talk to my cousin, who did this and this. They have an interesting story." And so that was really important in terms of making initial contact. Another tool that was indispensable was WhatsApp. Basically, WhatsApp is the mode of communication for the Campos Menonitas. I was interviewing Claudia Perez Howlett, who is currently the director of the Oficina de Enlace, the resource office between the government of Chihuahua and the Mennonite community. And she was saying that that's how she makes most of her contacts within the Mennonite community, is through WhatsApp. And so people from all different backgrounds, to the very traditional to the very liberal, everybody's connected there on WhatsApp. And so it made those contacts easier in a way, because you would interview somebody and say, "Oh, do you know anybody else who would be interested or who has an interesting story?" And they say, "Oh, so and so. Let me send you their WhatsApp contact." And then I would contact them through WhatsApp. Say, "Okay, I met this person. They said you might be interested. This is who I am. This is what we're doing." And yeah, it was just really wonderful and really facilitated that snowball technique, because WhatsApp is in that way sort of like the same structure as that very communal way of interaction, very like interconnected way of doing interpersonal relationships. And so WhatsApp was just the tool, to be using for this project. So yeah, that was the importance of technology.
Yeah, and so in that way, it kind of functions as initial sorting, where you can contact people, and those with no interest are immediately sorted out. You don't have to spend any more time really trying to, track them down in person and then talk to them and then find out they're not interested and so on. So it really speeds up that process and lessens the time of finding participants who are willing to participate. Mm-hmm. And then also, just kind of as a side note, an interesting note is the role that there was a publication, and I'm not sure what it was called in Spanish.
Was the Menonitas Destacados, basically like inspirational stories like from the Mennonite community that the Oficina de Enlace, the Mennonite Resource Office, had put together to offer just as a sort of like a testament to members of the Mennonite community who were inspirational, who had done good things within their community, who had interesting stories, people who sometimes had pushed the boundaries concerning education access, education reform, the arts, different sorts of things like that. And so that publication put out by the government was also really pivotal in finding specific people with these stories of cross-cultural interaction that would be good to interview. And so I would say at least 3 or 4 people that were interviewed came directly from that publication. And it was funny because I would ask Veronica, like, oh, I was reading about this person. Do you know them? Oh, yes. Or, no, I don't know that person, but I know this person who does. And so again, like even through those types of ways of getting context, like it always goes back to the personal. And to the personal relationships that you have. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very good. And so this discussion of the use of technology in this project, of course, kind of brings up the caveat, the fact that in any kind of social research, there is a certain population, within the broader population that you will be able to find and interview. And there are certain populations that are more difficult, if not impossible, to reach. And that was also true in this project. I mean, talking about the heavy use of technology and social media, it doesn't automatically filter out those who don't use those technologies, but it definitely caused us to lean toward those contacts which are more readily available through those technologies.
Yeah, and so something that I'd like to say about that is that, so in kind of the first stage of interviewing, the people that you have access to are people who in some ways are more public people anyway, people who are pastors, people who are teachers, people who not only are there on social media, but have very like an active presence and are used to and willing to talk in a public sort of way. And so that was kind of the first level of access. And then through those particular individuals, getting more and more access to other contexts, people who maybe at first wouldn't have been, the first to volunteer for, oh yes, I want to be interviewed, for this type of a project, but who had valuable and interesting stories to share nonetheless. And so those, I think, were the populations that were most accessible. I knew that the more traditional communities would be more difficult to access, just because we don't have a specific connection to them, and because just in general, they can be a little bit more separated off. And so to make that kind of connection, you kind of have to be several people in. And so those contacts were a little bit more difficult to find as well. I knew going into this project that I wanted to interview people from an indigenous background, people, Raramuri people, but I knew that would be the most difficult contacts to obtain, just because, first of all, a lot of times with a language barrier, a lot of times just the way that the social dynamics are, the closeness of connections between Mennonites and indigenous people are a bit different. And so again, you have to go sort of several people in, several steps in to be making those contacts. And again, I was finding that people from more marginalized communities, whether it was indigenous communities or people within the working class of mestizo culture, again, were more difficult to access in terms of contacts, and really wanting those perspectives, but knowing ahead of time that these are going to be kind of the most difficult to be seeking out, just because of our positioning coming in and our contacts coming in. And so again, going through several kind of levels of the bola de nieve to be making those contacts.
Yeah, and like was mentioned, but just very obvious in this project is the kind of language barrier, and even in the context of Mennonites, just because neither of us speak Plotich well, even though I can understand a decent amount, I don't speak it well enough to conduct interviews in Plotich, and so that was just one thing to keep in mind with this project, I guess.
Yeah, it was really limited to people who could interview in English or Spanish. And so, like you said, Plotich speaking people or Tarahumara speaking people, that was a limitation, of this project.
Yeah. So let's talk for a minute about the interviews themselves. Tell us a little about the questions you asked. Were there questions that were kind of common to all participants or more specialized for each individual, or how did you develop questions for the project?
And so there were kind of like two different streams of questions that I had in each interview. One was common to all of the interviews, and that was basically exploring the person's background, family experiences, connections to the Campos Mennonitas, and then also looking at what types of interactions between cultures were common in their families and the communities in the time that they were growing up, or how those interactions had changed over the course of their lives. And so for all participants, really wanted to kind of get those responses from everybody about their backgrounds and about their experiences cross-culturally. And so the more specialized questions would be specifically related to the person. So if I knew that, for example, I was interviewing teachers, I would ask specific questions about their experiences teaching, about the education reform that had happened in the Campos, or if it was a cross-cultural marriage, asking questions specific to relationships across cultures. And so in that way, kind of getting both of those aspects of like the big picture issues of cross-cultural interactions, but then also like those individual stories that come out of, the personal experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the purpose of this project is to collect stories, let people speak for themselves and their experiences. And at this point, at least, it's not an in-depth analysis and comparison of, the different stories and so on. But I don't know if there are any kind of just initial interesting facts or patterns that kind of just jumped out at you that were maybe surprising or interesting or just common. I know, as we already talked about, just the use of technology within the Mennonite community and the entire region, the different cultures, the different peoples, was, I don't know if it was higher than I expected, but it seemed very high to me. People mentioned all the time about how the use of technology and social media just had kind of skyrocketed within the last, 3 years, 5 years, mm-hmm. something like that.
Yeah.
And many people just kind of said that the use of technologies is an extremely important factor in what they perceive as very rapid cultural changes and shifts. Whether that is true or not, I don't know, but in their perception at least, that was extremely important.
What I thought was interesting is that seeing a pattern in interviewing people who more readily self-identified as bridge builders, the commonality of saying, well, when I was growing up, my family was a little bit different from the norm in terms of cross-cultural interactions. Our family was more open. And so what's interesting is that you see sort of like a family legacy, like going back 2, 3, even 4 generations of, well, my family kind of did things a little bit differently, or we from the beginning were more open in those interactions. And so that's a pattern that I kind of encountered kind of across the board. And then something else, I don't know how many interviews we heard this in, maybe like 6, 7, maybe even 8 interviews, is just about the changing perceptions of the interactions between mestizos and Mennonites, and people talking about, how when they were growing up, or when their parents were growing up, hearing about like, oh, if you're bad, the Mexican is going to come and take you away. And sort of like that stream of storytelling that appeared, in several of these interviews, and talking about like, wow, like in my life and in my community, like, oh, how that has changed over time, but that it's also still present. So that was something that kept coming up again and again and again, as kind of like the history of mistrust between communities, but then how that has been changing and shifting over time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think everybody who was asked about, why, what were those relationships like in the past, those interactions at the beginning and how they changed, everybody said directly, specifically that, the business interactions were allowed at the beginning, were always allowed, and that over time it seems like that has evolved into more personal interactions and relationships. So that's an interesting kind of evolution of interaction, I guess.
Well, and how like proximity, like over time, like basically necessitates like those changes in relationships. And especially as people were transitioning, from horse and buggy to vehicles to, your ability and access to the city and other cultures, like, it was just a matter of time, before you started seeing those shifts.
Yeah. And then for me, I guess, it was interesting to see and hear about people's perceptions of changes in language use. Like we said, everybody that we talked to obviously spoke Spanish or English. Many spoke both. Many people spoke 4 languages: Spanish, English, Low German, and High German. And it was interesting to hear people, talk about how the use of English has skyrocketed among young people in the last years. Several mestizo Mexicans or Mennonites that were more embedded into mestizo culture kind of felt hurt by that to some degree, where they felt like there had been within the Mennonite community kind of a anonymity against or towards the Spanish language, and they'd tried to stay with German for all these years, and now all of a sudden people are opening up to the use of English, and so that was interesting to kind of hear. And it's obviously the case, as Abby talked about earlier, that the transmigration of Mennonites to the U.S., to Canada, and back, and as well as to other, parts of Mexico, Central and South America, kind of back and forth, kind of facilitates that. And then added to that, the technological growth, the use of technology. People talked about, the internet is slow on the weekend because everybody's watching Netflix, and so, I don't know if there was this anonymity ever towards Spanish, but it's a possibility.
Well, and it's interesting because, there's definitely, with that influence, from the United States, and that in terms of a hierarchy of languages, and a social placement in terms of what language gives you a higher social status. And so I think we kind of see in some ways those tensions between the United States and Mexico playing out in that dynamic of the mestizo people, and then also the Mennonites who are more integrated into mainstream mestizo culture, feeling like that is a value judgment on Spanish,
right.
And that those power dynamics that are playing out between the United States and Mexico.
It's interesting. There's the kind of the joke among the Mennonites, which is some Mennonite who only speaks German goes to Canada for 3 months to work and comes back and pretends he doesn't know German anymore and can only speak English, even though he speaks terrible English. And it seems like that joke stems from this kind of idea that, you shouldn't, kind of look down on our German language. But you do kind of get the impression that same, like Abby was saying, kind of the hierarchy of languages that those same Mennonites would kind of look down on the Spanish language. That would be the impression I would get at times, and maybe with certain people, and although it may be changing now. And there were definitely, I think if you asked people directly, they would say that's not true.
Well, and it's interesting to see how the primary language of instruction, even in not the most traditional schools, but more traditional schools than before, the primary language of instruction is in Spanish. There's so much socializing that happens in Spanish. And so there definitely has been a big shift in the usage of Spanish as well in the Campos Menonitas. Yeah. And so it's just really fascinating to look at these these complex linguistic relationships that are converging, in this specific place.
Right, and so an analysis of those kinds of topics is far beyond the scope of this project, but it is interesting to kind of see and hear, people's stories and opinions and thoughts, and so those are a few things that kind of stood out within the interviews. Let's ask some questions about the research project itself. Maybe how the idea was born, how it kind of turned into reality. What is the history of the project itself, Abby?
So I talked a little bit at the beginning about sort of like the genesis of this project in the stories, that I would hear growing up in Seminole from friends parents. And so over the years, you just had these stories from Mexico kind of percolating. In 2013, I did a collection of poetry that was based on these stories that I was hearing from people in Seminole. But it felt incomplete in the way that I was the one telling these stories. And I felt that it was really important to kind of turn the mic around and talk to people directly living in the Campos today, people who themselves had grown up in the Campos that maybe are living in another place, whether that would be Seminole or Chihuahua. And so that was kind of how the project was born. And like I was saying before, I had worked on some other projects with Veronica Enns, who is living there in the Campos, working as a visual artist. And so really without her, this project wouldn't be possible. And so it was through the contact with her that it really seemed that this project could be possible. And so I applied for a grant from the Platt Foundation in Winnipeg, Canada. And the project was approved. And so we had financial backing, we had the contacts down there, and that is what made the project a reality, change from just this idea like that was in my mind to something that was like physically happening on the ground.
Very good. And so it's kind of clear how the project kind of grew out of personal experience and history. And so you've kind of talked about your side of that. I guess it would only be fair to then for me to talk about a little bit of my history and my interest. And so, like I said, I don't speak Plotich, and that's because I grew up in Canada, or was born and grew up in Canada. But my father was born in Quinta Lupita, or in Mexico, and kind of grew up in Quinta Lupita, which is just outside of Cuauhtémoc. And then later, as an older child, the whole family kind of packed up and went to Canada. And that's where he met my mom in Bible school, Steinbeck Bible College. I was born then in Ontario and lived in Manitoba and Ontario. And when I was 11, so I guess that would have been in the 90s, mid-90s, the Gospel Mennonite Church in Seminole, Texas, brought our family down to Texas as pastor couple of the church. And so that's kind of where I grew up, there in Seminole. My grandparents, on both sides, my mother and father's side, were born in Mexico. My grandfather on my father's side had ended up leaving the family, which is why they went to Canada. And my grandfather lived in El Paso, Texas, for those years that my dad was growing up in Canada. And I really only got to know him when our family moved to Texas when I was 11, and those years after that. And so our family, at that time when I was a young teenager and those first years living in Texas, we did take a trip down to the Campos, to Cuauhtémoc, and visited various cousins of my dad's, and second cousins, the third cousins, and all the levels of cousins. We were there for a couple of days, and then I've also visited Steinreich Bibelschule there in Campo, is it 38 and a half? Mm-hmm. I've had several friends from Seminole who went to school there, graduated from there, and my friend Billy Froese is still a teacher there during the semester sessions. But to be honest, I never really felt that connected to the Mennonite colonies in Mexico. I didn't grow up learning Plotich German. My parents still spoke it well. I would not make a judgment about that, although I would say now, having been there, it was very interesting to see, people who kind of grew up speaking the multiple languages. And so that would be helpful, but that's just not how it worked out, so.
Well, and it's interesting because you talk about not speaking Plotich, but you do understand quite a bit, and I feel like in this project that was very, very helpful, and...
Yeah, a bit. I do understand quite a bit, and most of that would have been just picked up from listening over the years to my parents, either speaking to each other or speaking to guests, church members, and so on. A lot of I feel like, especially in Seminole, when we went to Texas, a lot of the members of the church still spoke kind of Low German, kind of in daily use, even though the majority would also have known English at the time. So, yeah, in many ways, this was kind of my first real kind of experience in the Campos, kind of looking at or just hearing the stories of the people there, being there for several months rather than a few days, kind of getting a sense of place, and in that way, in many ways, it was kind of the sense of homecoming, like, oh, these are kind of my roots. Homecoming not, I guess, but definitely a sense of, oh, this is where my parents kind of came from, and it probably was, because of the experiences of my dad growing up, with his father, my grandfather being excommunicated from the Old Colony Church, and then his father kind of leaving, kind of living in poverty, kind of being on the outskirts of mainstream Mennonite culture, kind of just having some tough experiences there, and then leaving. Maybe it's a judgment on my part, but there's kind of the sense of, for my dad, maybe there is the, maybe Mexico kind of held some of that pain from those memories. Maybe not, but that was kind of the sense that I got over the years. We came from Canada, and that has changed somewhat after having lived in Seminole for years. It's somewhat different, but all that to say, it was interesting, kind of seeing the place, and hearing the stories, and yeah, just feeling like, oh yeah, this is where they came from. So that was interesting.
And I think, to add to that, maybe that was in some ways another motivation, like, for this project, is that a lot of time there is a lot of sort of negativity like floating around about Mexico and about the Campos in Mexico, and then just this desire to show sort of like the range of experiences and things, you know, that are happening there. Those painful memories, especially like for people excommunicated from the old colony, is very real, very palpable. And also like the whole like range of experiences that are happening in the Campos, in addition to those memories and then the violence.
Yeah. Yeah, that is very much the case. Yeah, it was good. It was a good experience. I appreciated the opportunity to go, and you know, if life allows, you know, maybe we'll be able to spend some more time down there at some point. Who knows? So, kind of to wrap up this conversation, here's a question that we asked, you know, all of the participants in the interviews. So do you feel like or consider yourself to be you know, a rebel, an exile, a bridge builder in your own kind of cross-cultural interactions in general, or you know, within the context of this project?
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of have that question like turned back on you. It's interesting because, you know, some of the people like totally like refused like any of those labels, and I can see why. Or this idea of like trying to like pinpoint yourself down as like, okay, am I a rebel, an exile, or a bridge builder? And I think in some ways, Veronica Entz in her interview talked about how that she felt like all of them at different periods of time in her life. And I feel like the same in some ways would describe my experience cross-culturally and just in life in general. And that sometimes like some of the things that you think that you left, or things that you feel, oh, maybe this doesn't have any relevance anymore in my life, or these different things, they keep like coming back on themselves and like keep returning. And so I think in some ways that sort of cycle of rebel, exile, and bridge builder is at work in my own life. And that sometimes that you end up being a bridge builder in unexpected ways, where you're not setting out to be a bridge builder, but like that's how things end up in terms of relationship, or these same ideas and people and conflicts, things just coming back around. And so it's one of those things where, oh yes, you know, you'd like to describe yourself as a bridge builder, but I think sort of that complexity of the intersection of all those identities at once.
Yeah. Yeah, and for the purposes of this project, I don't think our purpose was to force people to label themselves or box themselves into one or the other, but more the purpose of the question was more of a kind of a spark for thought and discussion. And like you said, many people kind of discussed, you know, how all three applied to them, to their life. And I think that is the case. I don't think there is a person who is just a rebel, or just an exile, or just a bridge builder. And a lot of it, the question has to, it also kind of demonstrates point of view. You know, do I consider myself a rebel from the people around me? Or on the other hand, do I feel like the people around me consider me a rebel? You know, does my church or the denomination or Mennonites in general, would they consider me a rebel or a bridge builder? You know, and so that's just an interesting aspect of the question. It kind of shows this perspective that you are reading it with and viewing yourself. And I think that's the purpose of the question. And so that was fascinating to hear some of the responses. And so then one other question that we asked participants was, do you have any thoughts about or hopes for kind of the future of cross-cultural interactions in the Campos? And I would ask you the same question from your kind of viewpoint of the outsider, maybe a little bit of the insider-outsider.
Yeah, and so I think it's especially like getting the perspective of people who, you know, had grown up, you know, some people like in the late 40s, early 50s, like hearing their perspective of how things were and how things have changed was really good to see in terms of like what's possible in terms of change, of connection, of interaction. And yeah, I think for me, just, you know, seeing those examples of in varied ways in different capacities and in different levels, like that we saw people interacting across cultures, sometimes, you know, pushing those boundaries, and then sometimes it's like, well, those boundaries like aren't there, or, you know, this has become normalized, you know, in some contexts with some people. And so I guess my hopes for those interactions in the community would just be that they would be continuing, that there would be an openness, first of all, of conversation, of interaction between communities. Something that I thought was interesting that kept coming up is the desire to maintain identity, whether that's Mennonite identity, mestizo identity, indigenous identity, but also to, while valuing that identity, still be making strides to have relationships with other communities and to be coming together to form a greater understanding of, maybe you don't agree on certain things, maybe there are these certain tensions, but there are also commonalities, things, goals that all the communities want to be working towards. And so that would be my hope, that people would be continuing to be making those connections across cultures, that those relationships between cultures would be, you know, continue to be sparked, and that would move forward in a positive way.
Yeah, I don't know if there's much I could add to that. So, but in general, I you know, this experience has been very rewarding for me personally. And I do feel, like I said, that I've kind of barely begun to, you know, kind of scratch the surface of kind of the personal connections and familial roots that are there in the Campos. And so I would just say that, yeah, there are kind of these, from my perspective, kind of clear and deep kind of shifts and changes taking place in the Campos. in the lives of various people, in the lives of individuals, as well as in kind of in the group as a whole, in the different cultures as a whole, in the area, kind of the territorial area as a whole. So yeah, I don't know. Do you have any final thoughts?
I think it's just what this project has showed me is that we just barely, like you said, scratched the surface, through the formation of these relationships, through the interviews, just uncovering all sorts of other interesting aspects in all sorts of fields, language, education, transmigration, just so many beautiful and complex relationships and interactions and issues occurring within this region that I was just glad to be able to see a little part of that, and really just thankful to have the opportunity to explore what's going on down there in the Campos.
Yeah. And so, I guess, kind of to wrap it up, I guess we just would like to say thanks a bunch to the supporters of the project, the D.F. Platt Historical Research Foundation, as well as the Mennonite Heritage Archives, both in Canada. And then there in the Campos, like we've mentioned several times, Veronica Entz was kind of the key participant who just opened up a lot of doors for us. And there were others as well, many others. Thank you to the Cabañas Las Bellotas for just allowing us to kind of have a base to work from and an awesome place to stay that was kind of close to everything and yet kind of isolated enough to give us the space we needed to do this kind of work. And also to the Museo Menonita there, close to Cuauhtémoc, and Director Tony Lowen of the Museo. And of course, there's just way too many people to mention each individually, but all the participants, all the people who did not participate and were not interviewed, but still supported the project in the Campos, in Canada, in Seminole, just everywhere. So thank you very much to all of you. You know who you are. And yeah, we're still currently working on getting videos prepared for the DARP Stories YouTube series. So be on the lookout for them. They'll be on YouTube, and we'll be putting them out on Facebook and other social media as well. So thanks again, Abby, for this conversation.
Oh, well, thank you very much.